Hey everyone, Tactics here, and today I wanted to talk about all 6 tank specs and how they're looking on the War Within beta and how they do actually compare and rank against each other in both Mythic Plus and Raid, now that we've had 2 weeks now of Mythic Plus testing, as well as normal and heroic raid testing, and even a few Mythic bosses thrown in there as well. I'm not going to be going super in depth on the hero talent stuff for each tank spec or all the individual changes they've had over the course of the alpha and beta, as I have individual videos on each tank spec over on my channel and linked in the description below, so check those out if you want more details. Now, of course, as a caveat, this is still beta, so we're going to be seeing significant adjustments both in tuning, talents, stuff like that over the next few weeks before the expansion comes out. They've even announced a full rework coming, I believe, to Shamans just next week. So there are still pretty big changes that can happen before launch. These are just my initial thoughts after a few weeks of testing. Before getting into that, though, I do actually want to quickly touch on scaling, because this is a pretty significant problem for some tank specs right now, and specifically that's health scaling relative to attack power scaling in this expansion, which, if I remember right, was also a problem back on the Dragonflight beta when they massively increased health pools to try and help a healing problem. But essentially what the issue is that health pools have dramatically increased by so much that tank self-healing spells that specifically scale with attack power almost across the board just feel extremely weak because they have not scaled accordingly. The impact here, depending on your tank spec, is variable, just based on the number of damage taken heals or percent health heals that the spec has. For example, a Blood Decay does not have many of those. Death Strike is based on your damage intake, so they're not really affected, but something like Prot Paladin is in a bit of a tough spot, as their Avenger Shield Absorb and their Word of Glory healing is based on attack power, and because they have such a high relative HP pool to their attack power, it's not really doing a lot for them currently. Guardian is another example where they have a percent heal in Frenzied Regen, and that's really, really powerful, but stuff like Ursoc's Fury and Elun's Favored is doing almost nothing in comparison. I'm not sure this is a tank-only problem either, as I've heard some healers discuss potential issues, but I just wanted to bring it to light as well, in the hopes that someone, at Blizzard takes a look specifically at tank self-healing based on these attack power abilities and maybe gives some of them a bump. With that said, let's move on to talk tank specs here. But we'll start with the spec very close to my heart, of course, Guardian Druids, where honestly not much has really changed for the spec gameplay-wise. Looking at overall throughput, both offensively and defensively, I'd say Guardian is in an okay spot. It's not the best in AoE or single target, but it's not super far behind. It's not terrible either, so it's just kind of fine. As I mentioned, a lot of their self-healing, though, is currently pushed into Frenzied Regen. That's where you're going to be healing yourself mostly, so things like Ursoc's Fury, currently very weak, and I'd like to see that resolved in some way. My bigger problem with the spec is mostly how plain the hero talents are. They don't really have an impact on how you actually play, and how restrictive their actual talent trees are. Again, I go into more details in the Guardian Druid preview, so check that out. But to give a quick synopsis, I guess, the hero trees are largely passive. There's no cool animations to kind of flare them up. Elun's Chosen enables you to play Lunar Beam a bit more, but it doesn't really change how you play. Lunar Beam, again, is mostly a passive mastery buff to you. The actual beam itself does very little. Druid of the Claw is essentially more of the same, where it basically is a proc off your auto attacks that turns Maul into a powered up raise. Again, very similar to how Tooth and Claw already functions. It's a bit odd seeing how that playstyle already exists within the spec. It also doesn't do a great job at all to emphasize weaving, where it's basically only something you consider in single target situations, and you only do it every like 30 seconds, so kind of disappointing for me. Moving to the talent trees, I think the class redesign did not really resolve many of the issues of the previous iteration. The only positive being that you can now easily access your Dispel when you do need it. You still have to spend multiple dead points to pick up abilities for other specs that you're literally never going to use. You've lost access to some utility, like Moonkin Form is no longer available in the tree at all, or any way, or baseline, anything like that. So you don't get something like Flap, which is pretty niche, but nice to have. Pathing is still just wildly confusing. Why are 2 CCs gating you behind getting your Stampeding Roar, and just gating you from even getting to the middle center of the capstone at all? You can't traverse across the tree whatsoever. It's a mess, and I think this thing needs to get blown up and just rethought, because it just feels like what they're trying to do isn't working. They're trying to fit 4 specs into one tree using the same kind of model they've used for other specs, and they need to try something different. I would like to see maybe the return of affinity points to kind of reduce the number of dead points in the tree. Having in the middle of the tree definitely needs to be addressed. You could even consider throwing something like Convoke into the class tree, because that's definitely something that would be nice to have in a lot of situations, even as a Guardian Druid, but it just can't compete being a choice node within Karn. There are some cool new things in there, like Fluid Form, and I'm happy they moved where that was in the tree, but it definitely still needs a lot of work. Now let's move to the spec tree, which, we just touched on in Karn there. I still have no idea why you have to invest 4 to 5 talent points to make that a decent ability. I will continue to beg them to make the 3 Berserk points into a single node. Outside of that, I don't actually think a ton of stuff needs to happen in the spec tree, because gameplay-wise, Guardian in Dragonflight, after their rework, felt maybe the best Guardian has ever felt in Mythic Plus. We go competitive with Legion. The additions of Raise, the additions of Incarn CDR to get away from being a 3-minute spec, something like Tooth and Claw actually being accessible, all felt really, really good for the spec. The bones are there. They just need to do some, pruning of 2-point talents. There's definitely too many. Adjustments of talent positioning, that kind of thing. No major crazy things need to happen to Guardian. It just needs to not feel as frustrating to navigate this tree as it currently does. Like things like Raise and Blood Frenzy, these are things that show up for other tank specs in the first or second gate, not in the capstone area, and we have to give up 2 capstone points to get those, right? It's things like that, things like the 5 points in Incarn that really, really need to be looked at to make the spec just feel a little bit better. Overall, Guardian does feel very similar to how it does currently in Dragonflight, performs fine in all forms of content, but I'm personally just a bit frustrated that a lot of the smaller problems many Guardian players have had with the spec and have given feedback about over the past couple years kind of remain ignored. Moving on from few changes to many, Brewmaster Monks are a tank that I'm really excited for in Season 1 of The War Within, as they've received significant reworks to both their class and spec trees. Plus, they've had one of my personal biggest issues with the spec addressed in button bloat. No longer are you going to need an entire piano keyboard of binds available to play this spec, and I've been having a great time messing around with it on the beta, specifically with the Master of Harmony hero tree. In terms of output, they did end up losing a significant amount of damage with the loss of some of the abilities they had, right? Resonant Fist is gone, Bone Dust Brew is gone, Tiger Statue is gone. You do feel the loss of all those abilities in terms of your overall damage, particularly in single target. But that being said, at least in a Mythic Plus environment, Master of Harmony allows you to kind of funnel AoE damage into single target, which is kind of interesting and helps to solve that issue. I talk about it in the Brewmaster video, but basically you build up this pool of extra damage, which is faster to build up on AoE, and then you can save it up and then spend it on a boss fight in single target. So at least in Mythic Plus, that issue is lesser, but in Raid, it can be a little bit problematic in terms of your overall single target damage. Damage aside, though, the durability of Brewmaster is now way up, being one of the sturdier tanks in Mythic Plus on beta based on my testing, which is definitely a nice change of pace for a tank that has really struggled in that department throughout Dragonflight, and a large part of that is the several new defensive talents they have in their spec tree that give them additional sources of healing, absorbs, and stagger increases, which are really helpful to start off the expansion. All things considered, I really enjoy the direction Brewmaster is going. I think these are a lot of positive changes, and I think they're going to be one of the best tanks in Mythic Plus in Season 1 if things remain the same, though they may not be the top tank in raids. From there, let's talk about the prots, starting with Paladins, who are probably the most impacted by the current state of the attack power healing that I was discussing earlier, and that really does hurt them in Mythic Plus situations in terms of their overall sustain and just how tanky they feel in packs. In Raid, it hasn't really felt too bad, though, and you, of course, have a ton of Raid-specific utility that is unique to you, like Spell Warding, of course, unique to Paladins, like Blessing of Sacrifice, and having 2 Raid buffs, which is always going to make Prot Paladins feel like a very strong choice in Raid content. On top of that, there has been some light talent adjustments in the Prot spec tree, which basically allows you to grab the off-healing package in Raid without really giving up anything, which is extremely nice utility, especially if you're playing Lightsmith, who has more Word of Glory procs and also an Absorb on top of that. And yes, I know I was talking about how their attack power healing, including Word of Glory, isn't great, but it's a much different story when you're healing a tank health bar versus a DPS or healer health bar, which is half as big, maybe even less than half as big as the tank health bar. That's how crazy tanks are right now with their health on beta. It's like we're talking like 7.5, 8+ million easily in like normal mode gear. So big health pools. Lightsmith does have a couple of problems though. The biggest one is mana related, which is kind of weird as a tank player, right? It really pushes you to spend your Shining Light procs to CDR your weapons as a Lightsmith, and that ends up making you run somewhere around the 3-minute mark of being in combat in any fight. The fix here is pretty simple. Of course, you need to put some sort of mana reduction on Shining Light or in the Lightsmith tree specifically. It doesn't even need to be 100% here. Something like 50% would probably be fine if you're worried about having too much mana as a prop paladin to off-heal too much or something like that, like they were in season 1 of Dragonflight. But something needs to happen here because it is not fun to just be playing the spec how it's designed to be played, spending those Shining Light procs, not wasting them, and then still running at like 2.5, 3 minutes. Lightsmith also is a bit clunky in Mythic Plus, specifically because you need to spend a lot more globals on non-damaging abilities, right? Your weapons, both of them, the offensive and the defensive one, are on the global. Shining Light procs, you have more of them as Lightsmith, and that's again on the global, and you want to be spending them more, which means that you aren't casting as many generators as you normally would in a Mythic Plus environment, which can hurt your Shield of the Righteous uptime if you aren't careful. So definitely harder to play in keys compared to Raid, but luckily Templar is also looking like it has some pretty nice damage and output overall, so you can always swap to that. Overall, Paladins are kind of the opposite of Brewmaster in my opinion right now, where I think because of their utility kit, they're extremely powerful in Raid. They're feeling a bit less tanky though, and because of that, they're maybe on the weaker end of Mythic Plus, but relying on those attack power heals, if that does change in some way, potentially they can be brought up, especially looking at the design of some of the keys right now and how important extra interrupts could be. Next up, we have Protection Warriors, who saw a rework to the class tree, but minimal changes outside of that, allowing Shockwave to be more accessible and potentially shifting you away from using Thunderous Roar and towards Champion Spear in the capstone area. Despite a lack of changes in their spec tree, there's still some very powerful options there for warriors that allows them to swap around and still maintain full shield block uptime, even with the reduced stats you have to start out the first patch. The expansion, essentially making them brick walls in Mythic Plus, where a large portion of the damage is from those melee swings. In my opinion, the most durable tank at the moment in keys. There's also some very, very juicy spell reflex in the current dungeon pool, which is allowing prot warriors to really crank out damage in a few of the dungeons. Their hero talent trees are a bit more like Guardians, where they don't really change much for you, but unlike Guardian, they have some pretty flashy animations, which can make them feel a bit different, even if they aren't different. Mountain Thane is basically just Prot Warrior being more Prot Warrior-y. They got Thunderclap emphasis, right? Colossus is all about lining up your CDs together and hitting like a truck in that little burst window. Outside of that, they play the exact same talents. They play the exact same rotationally, so there's no real change between them. Regardless, though, if you're looking for a really beefy tank that has respectable damage and maybe really powerful damage in spell reflex situations, Warrior is for you, and they're my current top pick for Mythic Plus content if that's what you're focusing on, while still being solid in raids. Then we have the king of raids, Blood Death Knights, where it's more of the same here in War Within, as they are my current top raid tank. Like Brewmaster, this spec received significant updates to both their class and spec tree, with some utility talents like Wraithwalk and Gorfian's Grasp becoming more accessible, several old talents getting a new look thanks to buffs to Consumption, Blood Drinker, and Bone Storm, and then some new talents to mess around with as well. Of course, their sustain is from Death Strike, and that is based on your damage intake, so it's not affected by those attack power issues I mentioned earlier, so DKs do remain a durable force in a raid environment. At the same time, they are absolutely pumping out damage near the top of all tanks in both AoE and single target. That being said, if you are looking at the spec in Mythic Plus, they still have that one major issue they've had throughout Dragonflight, where they have those periods where they are extremely susceptible to plain old melee swings, which can be problematic when pushing into higher keys. Not impossible, but definitely more challenging than other tank specs. That being said, there is potential for them here still, as currently Bone Storm, which now costs Bone Shield charges to use, does not CDR your rune weapon. Now, this, I assume, is intentional because Bone Storm also refunds the same amount of Bone Shield charges that it used, and frankly, having a 50-second CDR on your rune weapon every minute is probably too much. But if they ever did allow this to CDR your rune weapon even partially, it could potentially push them over the edge and give them significantly more rune weapon uptime, which would be very good for dealing with this issue. With all that said, DK is extremely powerful in Raid next expansion, and while they may not be the tank able to do the highest keys in Mythic Plus, if you're just wanting to do weekly keys and blast without needing to worry about relying on healer for help, they're still an extremely powerful choice. And that brings us to the reigning meta tank from Dragonflight, Vengeance Demon Hunters, who have lost their double sigil utility going into the War Within. Even so, I think people are dooming a bit too much about the spec, as it's looking very solid in both Raid and Mythic Plus, largely due to their hero talent trees giving them a significant boost. When it comes to Mythic Plus, Fellscarred gives you a lot of passive tankiness on top of increasing your uptime on meta and Sigil of Flame thanks to various resets, giving the spec a much needed defensive boost to start off the expansion. On top of that, Sigils still have a ton of value in keys, even if you only have a single charge of them, and you still have the most stops out of any tank spec, so there's still a lot of control to be had as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. When it comes to Raid, Eldrazi Reaver doubles down on the damage amp windows of the spec, allowing you to put some crazy damage numbers out as a tank in single target situations. And this even recently caught a buff, reducing the souls required to actually trigger the damage amp effect from 40 to 30, allowing you to line it up more nicely with the 45-second fiery brands if you're running down in flames. You also have the on-demand 10% DR from Fellblade in this tree, which is extremely impactful in a raid environment where a lot of the tank damage is usually concentrated in small windows, and you can kind of layer all these things together. That being said, I would be lying if I said it didn't feel a bit worse, because you're losing all the haste you currently have at the end of Dragonflight, and you're losing a very powerful, impactful tier set bonus, but I do think the hero trees do a solid job at making the spec feel better, both in Raid and Mythic Plus, especially when you compare these hero trees to some of the hero trees other tanks have. Overall, I don't think VDH is the best in either Raid or Mythic Plus, but I think it's a very, very competitive option in both in terms of output and survivability, so it's a decent all-around choice if you do enjoy the spec. Now, I've talked about all the tanks. I, of course, need to put them all on a clickbait tier list so that I can be clipped out of context. So here they are in all their glory. I've got the Mythic Plus tier list for tanks on the left here, and then the Raid tier list on the right here, again, based on the current state of beta. This could change tomorrow if a build mixes things up, if attack power scaling, healing, and that kind of stuff gets fixed. Buffs, nerfs, whatever, it can change, of course, so keep that in mind. I also have not considered the strength of any of the DPS or healer specs for the tank specs here, as that is something that can drastically impact the tank meta, because often, at least in Raid, you're going to be filling in Raid buffs. Even in Mythic Plus, though, like if Windwalker is super strong in Mythic Plus, that hurts Brewmaster. If Havoc is really weak in Raid, that helps Vengeance Demon Hunter, right? So something to keep in mind there. Starting with keys, I got Prot Warrior on top, like I said, super tanky right now. Really good spell reflect value. You can still spec into Disrupting Shout for some AoE control on the caster, so pretty nice. I think Brew is probably a pretty close second in terms of, feeling durable and also having a solid damage output, especially if you're using that kind of boss damage funnel I was talking about with Master of Harmony. Vengeance Demon Hunter still has very powerful control, and the durability boosts from Fellscarred on top of the passive ones, as well as increasing your uptime of your other defensive, very good. But like I said, I think Paladin could move up this list if attack power scaling, healing gets fixed for them. I think DK could move up this list if they get Bone Shield charge, some sort of CDR when they press Bone Storm on their weapon. That could really help them out, so things to keep in mind here. Moving to Raid, I have DK on top. Again, they're invincible tanks. They do a ton of damage. They're just kind of the full package. Vengeance is kind of DK light right now. Very similar damage. Very tanky as well. Also kind of immortal. But, the question is, is that unique utility there? Kind of, right? Sigils maybe have value on the last boss. We'll have to see. Grips are more likely to have value, but not necessarily having value. If, again, Havoc is super weak, Vengeance could shoot up this list. Paladin always has that insane utility. That's why they're up here. Spell warding is insane. Sack is insane. Even if their throughput is worse than both Blood DK and Vengeance in terms of overall damage and survivability, they're still a very powerful choice, especially for cutting edge rating. And same deal down here. Warriors, if DPS warriors kind of suck, Prot Warrior shoots all the way up. Insanely tanky, right? Not something you're super concerned about. Same with Druids. If the other Druid specs aren't great, Guardian is perfectly serviceable. You can play Guardian. So those are all the things to kind of consider there with these two tier lists. And I'll probably be doing an update, a month and a bit down the line when we're closer to launch. So there we have it, guys. That is my current thoughts on tanks in the War Within beta. I would love to hear what you guys think, though. What are you planning to main at the moment when the new expansion launches? Let me know down in the comments. As always, I need to thank all of my amazing Patreons for their continued support. Could not do this without you. And I'll see everyone in the next video.